Order, order, and a very warm welcome to this oral evidence session with Emma Douglas, who is currently the non-executive chair of Pensions UK, but is also the Wealth Policy Director for Aviva. And you are here today, Emma, if I may call you that, as the preferred government's candidate for the role of chair to the Pensions Regulator. So again, very warm welcome, and we look forward to discussing in detail your potential new role.
Thank you.
I'm going to kick off if that's all right, and we've all got questions for you. I just wondered, you've got an extensive experience and background within the pensions industry. What specifically do you think that you will bring to the role of the chair of the Pensions Regulator?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Debbie. I think that probably three main areas. So first off would be pensions knowledge. I've worked in the pensions industry for over 20 years. I've run defined contribution pension schemes. I've worked for asset managers, insurers, employee benefit consultants. And I think what that knowledge has brought me is kind of an understanding of a number of the viewpoints in the industry. So that would be, the employer, the trustees, their advisors, the investment managers involved, and I think probably most importantly, the end member of the pension scheme, because that's why we're here. But it's really helped to have worked in all those different roles in the industry. I've been scheme strategist for 2 master trusts, been through the authorisation process for master trusts, so I've got a good background of knowledge in pensions. Second one I would say is my chairing experience. So currently chair of Pensions UK. I've been doing that since 2021. Before that I was chair of the policy board, and I've actually worked with that organisation for over 20 years. So I was always very keen to get involved in an industry body because I really felt that I could give something back there and also help to influence. And I suppose the final one is relationship building. So, throughout my career I've worked with a lot of people in the pensions industry, also worked with government and regulators. And, as chair of Pensions UK, I will host various roundtables, dinners, to bring people together to try and discuss some of the key issues in the pensions world. One of those examples would be the recent Mansion House Accord. Well, I was heavily involved in working through the industry what would be the right percentage figures to set for a target asset allocation into private markets, what kind of guardrails and constraints did we need. So that's just one example of how those relationships have helped me. So those would be my three things.
Thank you. And thinking specifically then, if you were appointed to the role of chair of TPR, what would your focus be, say, over the first year and then over the course of your 5-year term?
And I think certainly for me, my focus would be knowledge building in the first year. So although I've been regulated, I haven't worked for a regulator, so I'd really want to understand how TPR go about things, their priorities, really get into the depths of the organisation. So that would be a lot of meetings, a lot of listening. Clearly need to get to know the current board. I do know some of the executives already, but building my knowledge about the regulator will be really important for me. And then also, I think prioritisation is going to be really key. There's a lot on at the moment in the pensions industry, as we well know. Makes it a massively exciting time to be thinking about taking on this role. But I think it does mean that, there has to be a careful view on the allocation of resources. Are they being put in the right direction? And also the regulator is transforming. So that's quite a big cultural change. And I would want to make sure that that was done in the best way so that the regulator turns into a more principles-based regulator, which is very much the aim that we have there. So those would be my shorter-term priorities, just to get my feet under the table. And then clearly we've got a lot on the regulatory agenda at the moment. We've got pension schemes bill. There's an awful lot in that bill that's going to be really important for the future of the industry. And then we've got Pension Commission coming with its findings in 2027.
Okay, so in you currently obviously working within the sector still, and you're potentially going to be a poacher turned gamekeeper. It's a phrase that has been used in other sectors as well. So how will you ensure that the independence that you need and a degree of detachment as well as relationship building is a difficult balance to have? How will you ensure that that's kept in check? You mentioned, for example, the Mansion House Accord and the mandate around investment. The sector we know isn't keen on mandation. How will you ensure that if that does become a requirement, that's conducted, that's followed through on?
Yeah, I think they're really good questions, Abby. So, I mean, I would see myself as a law-abiding citizen turned gamekeeper rather than a poacher, but yes, absolutely, it's moving to a different side of the industry. And what I found that's been really helpful for me when trying to make sure that I was independent, particularly my role as chair of Pensions UK, is really thinking about the end member. Ultimately, that's kind of who we're here to serve. So, are these decisions being taken with their interests at heart? How will it impact them? What will be the end result of that? And I think that kind of guides a lot of the decision-making process, what you say after that. Mandation, absolutely. That's very much a live topic at the moment. I've certainly heard the pension minister say that mandation is there as a backstop. It's there if the industry is unable to deliver on the Mansion House Accord. And then I think that clearly there's live debate going on at the moment about the scope of those powers within the bill. So, still I think plenty to work through there. Once the will of Parliament is decided, once the bill becomes an act, once those powers are there, then clearly it is the role of the regulator to enforce that. And I think it would be really important for TPR to work very closely with the FCA on that, because those rules will apply across trust-based pensions, TPR's world, and contract-based pensions, the FCA's world. So those would be some of the considerations I'd bring to bear.
My final question before I hand over is what do you hope to get out of this role?
So I just think it's such a massively exciting time for pensions. I mean, obviously it's always an exciting time for pensions. I love pensions, but at the moment there is so much going on in the industry. So to have the privilege of being, chair of the regulator at this time, when we have so much change, so much chance, I think, to make things better for people, to make the pensions industry work better for the people that it serves, it's a really exciting opportunity for me. I had been looking for a move into non-executive roles, so when this one came up, it was just so exciting to see it.
Joanna Baxter.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Emma, for joining us. Do you have any intention of returning to work in the pensions industry?
I don't, no plans to do so.
Okay. And is this the first role in which you would be required to act independently of your industry colleagues?
It's certainly much more important to be independent in this role. To a certain extent, the role of Chair of Pensions UK has been taking an industry view rather than a commercial view for the employer that I work for. So I have some experience of that, but I think the TPR role does take it to another level of independence of the industry.
Can you give us an example where you've had to act independently despite pressure from your contacts?
Sure, and I think one of the things that I've been actually most proud of as an industry initiative is the retirement living standards. So they came into play when I was chair of the policy board at Pensions UK, then PLSA, and we had some independent research from Loughborough University. It's very much looking at a basket of goods, and there was a lot of pressure and debate about whether these were the right metrics and the right standards. So should there be 3 standards? Should there be 5? Are they unattainable? Do they work across all industries? What should they be called? Is minimum the wrong name? should you actually put in rental costs, that they're not in there at the moment. So there was an awful lot of discussion, pressure from different groups around how do we actually make these work? Should they be actually an income target that you need rather than an expenditure target of money that you're going to spend? But in the end, myself and the group of people that were working on those at the time held to the line of, we need to go with that independent research. We need to go with what Loughborough has given us, but learn from all of the questions and concerns that people had so we could communicate clearly what these are and what these aren't.
And can you maybe talk to us about the areas of industry poor practice that you think the Pensions Regulator should be doing more to address?
And I think that the regulator is really focused at the moment on things like pension scams, and those are obviously absolutely egregious and horrible, and I've seen the regulator do an awful lot of work on that. As a provider, we'd be signing up to pledges, we'd have to put processes in place. So I think pension scams are just a shocking worry for us in the industry. So that's really important. And then the other one, of course, is governance of pension schemes. So there's a very live consultation out there at the moment on trusteeship. Have we got the right models? And I think there are more concerns for, can smaller pension schemes actually deliver on good governance? That's not to say they can't, but there's probably more concerns at that end of the industry. Also, I think the implementation of value for money, which should be coming in 2028, clearly in the pension schemes bill at the moment, that's another area where I think, TPR and FCA will be very involved in looking at where are the areas where members are not receiving that value for money, but will have a much better framework to be able to judge whether people are getting that value for money or not.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Rushnara Ali.
Thank you. You have savings, pension savings with bodies that are regulated by the Pensions Regulator and shares in Aviva and LNG. Do these amount to a substantial share of your overall wealth?
So I did look at this, and in totality it's slightly less than a third of our overall household wealth.
Thank you. And what are the arrangements that are in place to ensure that you don't see any information that's market sensitive, market relevant to these companies?
So TPR have a very strong conflicts of interest policy, as you would expect. Clearly, I will be declaring these as interests. And as chair, my understanding is that it's far less likely that I will be dealing with individual schemes. That would clearly be the responsibility of the executive. However, of course, on occasion, something about an individual scheme where I had an interest could come to the board, and at that point I would need to excuse myself from the discussions. I don't think that should stop me taking on the role, but clearly that will be something that I'll be discussing further with TPR about how we make sure that the policy is implemented properly.
And what proportion of the role would you expect to be precluded from, because of potential conflict of interest?
I think a relatively small amount, just because the chair will be dealing mainly at the strategic level, at the industry level. The executive would be dealing with the individual schemes, but that's not to say that there wouldn't be some possibility that those things could come to the board, and at that point I would need to step out of the room, and I would have declared all of the interests.
Thank you. And I just wanted to pick up on the previous theme around moving to regulating away from an industry you've worked in. Obviously there are great advantages in that, given your deep expertise. Can you elaborate on how you would signal the importance of standing up for consumers, if you like, those who are policyholders and so on, and give us an example of an area that you think, could really demonstrate that you are able to have that focus because and build that confidence that just because you've happened to come from an industry doesn't mean that you wouldn't be a tough regulator where that is needed in the interests of policyholders.
Absolutely, and I do think the value for money regime will be a great example of this, because there we will be looking at across industry at standards, and so there will be a collection of data. All of this is still, subject to final rules and regulation, but the concept is very clear that there will be measurement standards in place that have not been in place to this extent before. So I think it gives you, and certainly me from my role as chair, a really strong independent framework to use when coming across as a regulator, because you'll be judged against standards. There will be rankings. There won't be very much room for discretion at that point. And I think that's a real example of how what's happening currently in terms of what's going through in the pension schemes bill will really help me demonstrate that independence.
Thank you very much.
David Baines.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'd like to try and get a sense of your view of how the TPR has been performing in recent years. Could you give us some examples? What's your take on its key achievements in recent years, and also anything it may not have done as well as it could have done, and any lessons it can learn?
Yeah, certainly, David. And I think, auto-enrolment and the implementation of that is clearly a really important achievement for the regulator. So, 97% of employers are compliant with their auto-enrolment duties, and we all know that auto-enrolment has made a massive difference to the pension landscape, 11 million more savers, and it's proved remarkably resilient as well. So those contributions have come in, opt-out rates haven't markedly increased through COVID, cost of living crisis, you name it, it's been a real policy success, and TPR has clearly been involved in implementing that, making that happen. Also, I think their work on scams is really positive. That's an absolutely vital part of the regulator's role. And then, coming on to areas that perhaps could have been better, I think, there's certainly lessons learnt from the LDI crisis, and I know that's come before this, this committee, or in a slightly different format before. And I think that what I've seen from, I'm obviously on the outside at the moment, but what I've seen is much more focus from the regulator, willingness to learn those lessons. So, how do you measure, the key issues around LDI? Have you got the right liquidity buffers? What kind of risk the scheme taking? How much leverage is there? Building up internal resources so that they've got, better ways to engage with those schemes, and really importantly, working across the regulatory landscape as well. So working with the Bank of England, looking at financial risk in a more systemic way, I think, than it was done in the past.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. You talked a little bit earlier about, so you've obviously played a big role in the Mansion House Accords, and also obviously the pension scheme bill still on its way through Parliament, largely welcomed by industry, but the issue of mandation being the most controversial aspect. It raises a big principle, such as fiduciary duty and the protection of savers versus a government objective. So there's a balance to be struck there. And then also the practicality of whether pension funds can invest reasonably in UK investments. What do you feel from your experience of it? Do you think, in terms of the pension regulator, do you think they played an effective role? Did they make positive intervention? Should they have intervened more, less? anything around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, to a certain extent, of course, the Mansion House Accord was very much the industry initiative. So it was the industry coming together to suggest what they felt could be done within those appropriate guardrails. And I think the regulator's role probably is more important later down the line, whatever we end up with as a mandation objective to deliver on that. What I would say, though, is that my recent experience of the regulator is they are much more engaged with the industry. They're very open. They come along to conferences, to round tables, to discussions. They're really willing to listen to the industry's views on things. So not only mandation, but a whole range of other issues.
Do you think the way they worked in that was more sort of informal?
Yes, probably more of a background role as the industry was pulling itself together to suggest something that that could work from their view.
And it sounds like you think that was the right way to play it. Yes. So you don't think they should have exerted a more directional or role in it, required?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that given that the industry was mobilising itself, 17 people signed the Mansion House Accord, representing a huge segment of the industry, I don't think there's necessarily a failure there that, needs strong intervention. So I think more of a background role was appropriate in that scenario. If there hadn't been the Mansion House Accord and there hadn't been that industry initiative, then I think that's a vacuum that would need to be filled, yes.
And on the specific issue of fiduciary duty, which one could say is a high principle, whether you think it's a good idea to invest in UK industry or not, there is a principle at stake here. Do you think the regulator should have said more about that? Or?
And I think what's in the Mansion House Accord is, when you're looking at the enablers that would need to be there in order to deliver on it, some of that is making sure that there are sufficient investments around to invest in, but the rest of that is making sure that it does align with fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty is still very much enshrined within the Mansion House Accord. We wouldn't want to be investing in these type of assets if they weren't in the best long-term interests of members. I think that the good news from the industry perspective is that the industry has already been wanting to and thinking about investing in these assets. It's a broader range of assets than are normally available in a DC default fund, but where they can deliver good returns, that's got to make sense.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I just follow up on this a little bit, if I may? And it goes back to part of the question that I asked you in terms of what you think your priorities will be over the next 5 years. And you yourself mentioned in terms of things that the TPR did well and real issues that weren't picked up until they were at crisis level. What would, in terms of the horizon scanning, what would you see as the key risks to be aware of over the next 5 years, so we don't have any more LDI?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So I think for DB, clearly DB schemes are in a better position now. So, 3/4 of them are, fully funded on a low dependency basis. That's a positive. I don't think any complacency is in order in that area. So what I would probably be looking at on the DB side would be making sure that those benefits are paid. So, when employers, if they're allowed to extract surplus, how is that done in the safest manner possible? We've got super funds coming into the market. How are they going to impact the overall market? Can we make sure that that's done in the way that is best protection for savers' benefits? So I think those would be probably my issues in the DB side. For DC, I think we do have some more fundamental concerns. So, clearly the Pension Commission is looking at adequacy at the moment. I think it's absolutely the right thing to look at. We already know that unless some action is taken, we've got a generation of pensioners coming through in the next generation that are going to be poorer than the ones now. And, I do worry about that lost generation. So people, who may be in the kind of Gen X, younger Gen X type generation who won't have as much DB benefits at a household level, but, they won't necessarily have been able to benefit from auto-enrolment for many years either. So, there's some real gaps there in the system. There's some real worries about adequacy. And auto-enrolment, while it has been a fabulous success, and it is one of my favourite things in pensions, it isn't fully inclusive. It doesn't cover the whole market. So I just think that's where I've got the biggest worries. And if we look a little bit further, I think also thinking about what happens in the 2050s, when people are retiring, their benefits are pretty much wholly DC by that point for most people. Aviva did some research looking that the average pot size would be £225,000. That's an awful lot of money for someone to manage and try and stretch out over their retirement. So how we help people make those decisions at retirement will be really crucial as well. Now, some of that is in the pension schemes bill, that's great, but those would be my worries, and they're more existential on the DC side right now.
Thank you. Lee Barron.
Yeah, thanks. Do you think that rule-making powers would enable the pensions regulator to be more authoritative and proactive? And if so, what powers do you think they would be?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because certainly from my point of view as a pension provider who is regulated by both FCA and TPR, it's very noticeable that TPR does not have those powers. And so what that can mean is there's delays, because clearly, for TPR, you've got to go through legislation, FCA can make the rules. So I think there probably is an argument in certain cases, with ministerial oversight, with the appropriate controls, for TPR to be able to make rules at the same time as FCA, because otherwise you can end up with a point in the industry where there's some rules that apply to the contract-based workplace pensions, but they don't yet apply to the trust-based pensions. And that doesn't make sense for the industry, and it particularly doesn't make sense for the end users of the industry. So I think that would be worth pursuing as a concept.
And how do you think that the regulators have worked together in the past?
I think that what I've seen, particularly on the value for money consultation, I know that's coming up quite a lot, but I do think it's so fundamental to how we regulate pensions in the future. I've really seen them working so closely together. So, when we're having meetings to discuss the progress of value for money, TPR's in the room, FCA's in the room, DWP's in the room, we're even getting FOS in the room, so there's so much regulatory consensus around that, and it's been really, really helpful. So I think I'm seeing more of that now than I'd seen in the past.
In any ways you think that can improve even further?
Yes, I think that there's still some anomalies. So well-designed performance fees are actually allowed in the trust-based defined contribution world, but not in the contract-based world. So, that means that, you've just got a difference. Where do you make some of your investment funds available to? Also, I think, FCA are introducing targeted support. So that's sort of helping people to, put people into categories. So people like you might want to think about this, and we don't have the same in the trust-based world. So I think that there are still areas where we could bring this together more effectively.
And that would be something that you'd look to drive through?
Yes, very keen to do that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. John Milne.
Yes, we talked, you mentioned about the LDI episode
Yes.
a couple of times. It was a major crisis which led to fall of the government. It had been argued that whilst the budget may have precipitated the crisis, that there was a weakness building up or a vulnerability building up in the system that should have been identified, and no one appeared to be looking out for it. Then the Financial Policy Committee recommended that the TPR should be given the remit, or should have had the remit, to have regard to financial stability considerations. Would you agree with that recommendation?
Yes, I would. Yeah, and I think that you're quite right that what we learnt from the LDI crisis is that pension funds are very much part of the financial system and should be looked at in the whole. Yes.
And you would agree that there was no one was really looking out for that beforehand, because it was there to be seen if anyone was looking.
Yeah, and it certainly didn't appear so. I'm looking at it from an industry participant rather than having been at TPR at the time. But yeah, it did catch people out. I think the LDI crisis. Yes.
It's very different answer. So what would you view as the most important considerations around financial stability with regard to your new role? And alongside that, to what extent do you think that TPR has the powers and capability it needs to do the job?
And I think it's really important, as I mentioned before, that the regulators work together, and they work together with the Bank of England. So I understand there's been some system-wide economic stress tests that TPR has participated in alongside the Bank of England. So I think that those kind of working together, looking at the financial system in its broadest possible sense, are really important for that to continue. And to date, I'm not sure that there's any extra powers required, but there's definitely close working is needed to make sure that data's shared appropriately, data's collected appropriately, and that Bank of England and all of the regulators involved work together on this.
Do you think that TPR, as it is now, does it have the capacity to foresee and hopefully prevent a scandal or a crisis of the LDI?
I think certainly there's much more focus on some of those key things that perhaps should have been focused on more beforehand. So the extent of the use of LDI, the extent of leverage, what levels of collateral buffers there are in the industry. And I think it's been positive that when we have seen market fluctuations more recently, the system has been able to withstand those shocks. There's much more stability in there. There's much more leeway. So I think there's some positives to take from it. And I'm looking at it in a kind of future. What should we be concerned about way?
Thank you.
Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming to speak to us today. So the current corporate plan runs until 2027. So what extent do you think this sets out the right priorities and performance indicators for the organisation?
Yes, I am comfortable that those priorities that are in it are the right ones. And so there's obviously 4 key priorities in there. What I would observe is that there's a lot of detail behind those priorities. It's a very busy time in pensions. So when you're looking to, safeguard saver outcomes, well, that's protecting DB benefits, that's making sure that DC members are able to make better decisions at retirement, it's value for money. There's so much under each of those objectives that I think prioritisation around those objectives and what lies beneath them will be really, really important. But I do think they're the right objectives, yes.
And what do you think your assessment is of where that corporate plan has been running up to now? Do you feel there's still quite a lot of progress in one of those objectives, maybe more than others?
Yeah, and I think that it's definitely a work in progress, and the pension schemes bill will really help deliver on some of those key aims, those fundamental aims to protect people's benefits in retirement. So I think it's a work in progress, but clearly TPR are committed to it and are working towards it.
Lovely, thank you. And we've talked about the getting the whole organisation behind the strategies and ways of working. So how do you intend to help support this at the pension regulator?
Yeah, and I think that hopefully I can bring some of the skills that I've learnt in my executive career in terms of enacting culture changes at organisations. And, it's quite a long process is what I've learnt. And, you have to start with your management team being very clear, being able to articulate objectives very clearly, onwards and downwards. And it also involves a lot of listening. So, why, if people aren't with the programme, why aren't they with the programme? What concerns do they have? How can you work through that? So, I know I'll be chair, so I'm not in an executive position, if I'm appointed, obviously, but I would want to work with the CEO, with the leadership team, just to share some of my knowledge and experience, and also hopefully be involved in collecting some of the views from the organisation.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Joy Morrissey.
And to what extent are you confident that the issues giving rise to industrial action in 23-24 have been resolved?
And to be honest, that's one of the questions that I would ask if appointed. So I don't think I have enough insight internally to ask it, but I do think it's a valuable question.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Turning to some of the long-term challenges you mentioned earlier, one of the key points is pensions adequacy, ensuring that clearly pensioners are saving enough and that we're getting the growth that we need. I just wondered what your thoughts were around the kind of expectations gap between what savers expect in retirement, what they actually are going to get in retirement, and how the regulator can support that education piece.
Yes, and I'd certainly be very keen, within the powers that the regulator has, to do as much of that as possible, Peter. I think that it's kind of almost the sort of the shadow side of the success of auto-enrolment. So auto-enrolment has worked so well, we've got people saving for their pension, but because it's automatic, people don't pay an awful lot of attention to it. And so what we tend to find is that people only really start engaging and thinking about their pension as they get quite a bit older, so, into your 50s perhaps. And at that point, if you realise that you haven't got enough saved, there's not so many options as to what you can do about it. So, I think that is kind of inbuilt within the system. And there's ways, I think, that we can try and, heighten people's awareness of their pensions. So Pensions UK and ABI, we're doing a Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign involving TV celebrities. So I think there's ways that we can try and bring pensions into more day-to-day conversation. I know TPR managed to get a line on pension scams into EastEnders. It's kind of normalising pensions for people, so that I thought it was great actually. But so yes, we can actually start talking about this. There's also things like mid-retirement MOTs. Trying to get people to think about not only their finances but their health, their plans. There are initiatives. And obviously organisations like MAPS will be heavily involved in that. I do think the dashboard is another chance to really get people engaged. So once we have that up and running, I'm really positive about the fact that that should bring more attention to pensions, and even being able to see your state pension on the dashboard, I think would be really valuable for people.
Regulation is always a balance between having sufficient regulation for safeguards and also ensuring that it's not overly burdensome to restrict growth. I just wondered what your take was on that in terms of, we mentioned earlier some of the previous reports about LDIs and other examples. I just wondered that there's a competing tension between not over-regulating and therefore restricting the growth of the pensions industry and putting too much regulation in and mean that we're not getting the returns that we need for our savers. How would you approach that?
Yeah, and we saw that as a very live example in the DB funding code. So, clearly you're looking to protect savers' benefits in DB. These are really, really valuable. But by restricting investment flexibility, that was potentially really penalising those open DB schemes that had a much longer investment horizon, could afford to invest, in much more growth-oriented assets. And so what I was impressed with the regulator there, and I was involved in some of these dialogues in my Pensions UK role, is that they were able to flex. So they were able to say, yes, let's treat those open DB schemes differently. They've got a longer investment horizon. We can give them more flexibility around their investments, whereas schemes that are, on a path to buy out, to wind up, to, an end game for DB, we're much more concerned about protecting what's there. So, but I think you're right. I think it's always a tension. But that was looking at the savers in each of those type of schemes and realising that they actually had very different needs.
You mentioned earlier about the move towards a more principles-based approach to regulation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and how that will be to benefit of savers?
Yeah, certainly. And I think I'm starting to see that from a master trust perspective. So, supervisory kind of meetings previously with the master trust were very kind of compliance focused. So, they're very much ticking the box. Are all the employers in the master trust paying auto-enrolment contributions when they need to pay auto-enrolment contributions? Not so much discussion around strategy. Now, there is much more discussion around strategy, around innovation. The regulator has much more focus on that, where it's in savers' interests. So I think that there is an evolution of moving away from a tick box exercise to something that is more strategic, is more open, does involve talking to the industry and getting views. But clearly there's a balance there as well, because there are some expectations set and compliance needs to be delivered as well. So I think that this again will be one of those balancing items.
And thinking of other long-term challenges, I mean, a number of us on this committee did serve on the Bill Committee for the Pension Schemes Bill, and there is, at the minute at least, quite a bit of a gap in between what's out there and what's going to be put in the regulation later on. That will obviously impact how the regime is then administered by regulators in the industry. Have you any concerns about that? The fact that so much of the bill, although we know the direction of the bill, is yet to be defined in regulation, and therefore there is this kind of gap, if you like, that exists currently.
Yeah, and I think that there clearly is a gap, and we will, as a provider in the industry, you'd need the regulations before you can build your systems. But I think we've got a very clear direction of travel, and we're getting a lot of ongoing discussion around some of those, those pressing issues like value for money in the bill. Slightly less discussion about small pot consolidation, perhaps, but that's towards the end of the plan. That will be more like 2030 rather than 2028. But yes, I think the industry is setting itself up to get ahead as far as it can on the principles, doing some of the strategic thinking, because we have got a clear direction in the bill, and the bill is building on a lot of the discussions that have been had in the industry to date. It's not a complete diversion from what we've been talking about for many years, but it's here. We're going to get an act. It's fantastic.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Emma, that has concluded the questions that we have to you, and I'm going to close this oral evidence session. Order, order.